there, it's Joy Foster, founder of TechPixies and the host of the Sparkle and Thrive podcast. And this is a classic interview that I've pulled from the archives. We've never published it on the podcast before. It was filmed a couple of years ago, but it's so relevant these days, especially in the summer, especially if you're busy trying to work and you've got people around you that would love your attention, and yet you still have to get the job done. Unicorn space is really a wonderful concept, and I hope you're going to enjoy my interview with Eve Rodsky, the author of both Fair Play and Unicorn Space, as she talks about the importance of everyone having time for themselves to do something that lights them up, that's not an obligation to anybody else. So enjoy this podcast.
Joy, you're in the book, as you know. So thank you for your contributions. And I love Katie. Thank you for having a next generation participate in this conversation as well. But this is really a book, it's my love letter to women. It's written to you. It's also written to women who come before us or after us. One man called me the ghost of Christmas future. But it's a book of understanding what happens to women when we're told and sold the lie that we can be and do anything. And life does feel pretty fair in an academic setting because you're judged by grades. And then the death by 1,000 cuts, Joy, as you know, that happens as you get out into the real world and experience sexism, racism, all the minoritization of women. And so even though Fair Play is a book about the gender division of labor, and it seems weird that a book about creativity would be the sequel, the idea of a passion gap was so prevalent in all of my research in 17 countries that once kids hit fourth grade, so that's about 10 years, if we just focus on being parents and or partners and or professionals, it was a really, really hard road back for women to say, I know who I am. I'm not lost in those roles. And so that's what this book is about. It's about refining ourselves or not losing ourselves in the first place.
I think you have a very powerful voice, really powerful voice. And I just remember meeting you in person right before lockdown, when Fair Play came out. So what I was saying before you came on was that Fair Play, you had a little line in Fair Play about unicorn space. You sort of touched on the idea of it and what it was. And this book really goes deeper into it. And I find it really interesting to read it because especially now that, and it's not that things have gone back to normal. That's not true. But because our activities have picked up again, I find in a funny way, it was easier for me to find unicorn space during the pandemic when we didn't have all of the running around and birthday parties to plan, et cetera, than it has been since. And it was such a great reminder that, hang on, we actually need to do this. And now I want to talk about the Post-it notes and the unavailable Post-it note in that story, but I also want to talk about the women you were messaging and, talking to throughout the time of writing this book, and the difference between them being excited about unicorn space and then actually taking the step to do the sticky note, I'm unavailable, door shut thing. So, that was people like the idea, but then when you actually say, right, are you going to go plan a whole day? And what does that look like for you? That's where they struggle. So yeah, share that story with everyone because they might not know it.
Yeah. So it was a really fun process during the pandemic of being able to watch other people start to think about how they wanted to reclaim their unicorn space. Now, I think it's really important to understand what a unicorn space is and why it's called that. I like to say, taking up space for women is still actually pretty provocative, all the way back from Virginia Woolf, where she said women couldn't be Shakespeare because we don't have any metaphorical or physical space. And I saw that all through my interviews in the pandemic of women sitting in bathtubs, with laptops on their lap and kids crawling all over them. But also bizarrely feeling profoundly isolated, even though they had people crawling all over them, saying, my partner took up the good space in the house, or I have no space, or I have to be in my car or hiding in a bathroom or a closet. So the idea of space is really interesting to me. And then the idea of a white space. People would ask, well, I need the white space to think, but a lot of my Black and brown friends and colleagues just didn't like the word white space because it just sounds like a place they can't be. And it's not a hobby, because when I asked about hobbies, that connoted in frequency. Yeah, I can, grab a game of chess in Washington Square Park once in a while. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is daily flourishing. And so once I realized that the science, Joy, showed that the word of 2021 was languishing, but what I hope for you, I gift you, the word of 2022 is flourishing. And we now know that acts of creativity, daily acts of creativity, lead to daily flourishing. And the emotion that I'm looking for you, which is why it's a unicorn space, it's mythical, it's magical. And the way that comes out is that you will have said to yourself, I can't believe I just did that. So a woman I spoke to this morning, she decided to become a polar bear, which is, a club where you jump into the ocean. She does it every Saturday morning. It's crazy, very provocative. Her husband, a man, takes care of his kids alone. She doesn't get any women to supplement his care. He takes care of his kids alone. And she goes with a group of friends. And so she said to me, that's funny you say, I can't believe I just did that, because just this Saturday after I did this jump in 4-degree water, I came out saying, I can't believe I just did that. Right. So that's the feeling of a unicorn space. And that's why it's not self-care. And it's why it's not adult friendships, because I could be with Joy and be like, I love Joy, but it's not going to bring me I can't believe I just did that, which is a little bit of rigor and a little bit of fear. And that's also linked to excitement, which is back to the daily flourishing. It's the opposite of the two top words women over the past 10 years have used in my word cloud that we collect over 17 countries were overwhelm and boredom when I asked them what they thought about their home life. That's a deadly combination. Flourishing, a unicorn space, I can't believe I just did that, is the opposite of that. And the idea of, I'll say one more thing about it. There is a program in this book. I can't tell you what your unicorn space is. I can help you find it and prioritize it. The cycle of a unicorn space is curiosity, connection, and completion. So my editor kept saying, well, let's get to that. And what I kept saying is, well, then I would just be like Cal Newport, who I love. He wrote a book called Deep Work. But he says, guess what? The solution to your problems is you just need 2 uninterrupted days a week.
Yeah. Well, and he also, I think that was it his book that said we just need naps too, or
naps. 100% take all your naps, protect your sleep. Well, women were interrupted every 3 minutes and 42 seconds in the pandemic. That was a Time Journal study in the US. So for me, the whole point of Unicorn Space was not just jumping into the program. It was using 100 pages where, Joy, you sit on those pages to unpack why the hell we don't do it in the first place. And that's the Post-it, that even for somebody who I work on boundaries, that's what I do, and systems and communication, which are the secret formulas to unicorn space, setting boundaries, having systems and communication, asking for what you need. Even I didn't know how to ask for what I needed during the pandemic. And that's where the Post-it came up. I started to wear an unavailable Post-it note on my chest or anywhere I went, so that they say, I'm here, but you see the neon Post-it, I'm really not here. And then, that wasn't really working. And my kids and my husband kept busting in on me. And finally I was like, why are you in here? Don't you know I'm unavailable? And he's like, I'm here because, to tell you your Post-it's falling off. And that was the end of the Post-it.
Well, and I think that's such a great point, because, and you talk about it in the book, where you lose the plot at one point, and then you feel awful because you've just yelled at everyone. You're like,
it ruined my unicorn space, Joy. And then I had guilt and shame the rest of the day for being a terrible mother. And I was like, this is not working.
Yeah. So, and I think we can all relate to that. And I totally can relate to that. And really where you get to that point where you're just so frustrated and you just say stuff that you do not mean. And then you got to deal with the aftermath of that, the quivering lip and the tears and all the, because that's what they go through. And so and you don't mean to, but you just get to that point where you're like, this is this, you get to that point. So you talk a lot about communication. You talked about it in Fair Play, and you talked about these high cognition, low emotion conversations versus high emotion, low cognition. And I found that invaluable. And you talked a lot about communication styles. And do you want to just run through the communication styles and what that high cognition, low emotion really means?
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a really great point. We can play a little game here, but I think what I was saying earlier is really important. There is a formula for thriving. There is, and that doesn't mean we're not breathing polluted air. Obviously, in the U.S., it's worse. We have no social safety nets at all, but you can still breathe even if you're breathing polluted air. And the way to breathe is boundaries, systems, and communication. Boundaries, systems, and communication. That is the secret formula. It is hard to get there. It doesn't happen overnight. But when you can pick one to work on and say, you know what, I'm working on my boundaries this week, maybe not with a Post-it. Maybe I'll do that through actually working on my communication, or believing that I deserve the permission to be unavailable. Or maybe this week I'm going to work on the systems in my home so that I realize that I can free up time because I don't have to hold it all. But I think the communication part is really interesting because there's 2 chapters on communication in a book about creativity, because besides not believing that we could be unavailable from our roles, that was number 1 for why people didn't take unicorn space. What do you mean I have to be uninterrupted attention for an active pursuit that I love? Being available is my identity. So really triggering to tell people they deserve a permission to be unavailable from their roles as a partner and or parent and or professional. The next was, well, even if I do feel I deserve the permission to be unavailable, I have like terrible guilt and shame when I actually use my permission to be unavailable. And that comes up in so many different ways. Joy, as you said, I talk a lot about that in the book. We'll talk about some guilt and shame reframes. But then the third runner up was, well, I don't have permission to ask for what I need. And that is that rage and resentment cycle of just like, I'll storm out. What was interesting, there was a group in the UK, and I watched them over the pandemic. Somebody introduced me to them. And it was a group called The Reasons I Hate My Partner in COVID, my partner and kids during COVID. And one woman writes in this chat of 27,000 members, if my husband dies during COVID, it won't be because of the disease, it'll be because of me. So I DM her and I say, hi, I'm a researcher. I talk about communication. I'd love to know how you communicate about domestic life because of your post. It was really, you got a lot of likes on it, a lot of laughs, and she wrote me back and she said, oh, thanks for the message. I don't communicate about domestic life. It's too triggering. This is my safe space. So let's just reflect on that for a second. Publicly threatening to murder her partner in a public forum of 27,000 strangers felt safer to her than directly asking her partner for what she needed. So that's why communication is so important. And so, yeah, let's play. Joy, I'll ask you some questions about your communication style because we might as well start jumping in boundaries, systems, we'll do it all. But I think talking about communication is really, really important piece of it. And one of the most important pieces is looking at how we communicate. So let me just find this little quiz because I'm going to ask you. So this is a reverse newlywed game. And the way we're going to do it, Joy, is tell me your partner's name.
Tim.
Okay. So I want you to think of a conversation you've had. Maybe it was over planning that water park nightmare or whatever. But think about a time when you had low cognition and high emotion. Okay. Let's think about that. Okay. Think about a time. So I want to know, reverse newlywed, what Tim would say about you. So I'm going to read you some communication styles. And then we will talk about why this is important, because there are 3 steps to reclaiming our unicorn space in communication, to ask for what we need, The first one is understanding what our communication style is for ourselves before we can actually.
And those of you
engage
who are
with
here
others.
live, you can play along in the
Yeah,
chat.
play along. I'd love for you to put it in the chat. So would Tim say that you're long-winded, that you're talking and no one's listening? Would he say that you use sharp commands, that your drill sergeant delivery isn't always popular with the troops? Would he say that you use bad timing, that you drop your grievances and requests for help or for asking for your unicorn space in inopportune moments? Thanks for the flowers. Oh yeah, and by the way, I'm leaving tomorrow for a 4-day retreat. Toxic word choice, AKA verbal assassin. Hey, just thinking, it's so interesting. You've really become the worst father that's ever existed. Like, did you know that was going to happen to you? That you'd be the worst parent that's ever been on this earth? That's a verbal assassin. Or as my son Ben said to my little daughter yesterday, he said, Anna, you have no real friends. They're just using you for your charms. My son's a verbal assassin. Okay. And she's 4. All or nothing. You never replace the toilet paper roll. You always leave the seat up. Dredging up the past. This is just like the last time you forgot to.
I'm totally dredge up the past.
Or one more. I'll give you one more for everybody here. Or avoidance. I wasn't going to say anything. I avoided this conversation. I really didn't say anything, but now I'm boiling over and I'm really pissed. So
yeah.
So help share us in the chat, but it sounds like judging up the past is a good one for you.
That tends to happen, right?
Like, and give me an example.
Well, I think, actually, until we actually got some support with how to communicate with each other, there was one issue that kept coming up. And it was because I was initially a verbal assassin. So for some holiday or something, he gave me some flowers, and they were actually very beautiful. They were carnations. They lasted for a long time. He gave me a lot of them, but I didn't have. This was early on in the marriage, and I didn't have like you said, the newlywed. I didn't have the appreciation for how to have I was just very honest about how I felt. And I said something along the lines of, thank you for the flowers, but like, could you have not bought the cheapest ones or something like that? And
poor carnations.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, I have a very large appreciation for carnations now. He could give me as many carnations as he wants, and I would absolutely love them. But I really, and this had to do with my real lack of deep gratitude. And so I had to do a lot of work for me personally on understanding gratitude and understanding what it was, because that is literally how I responded to that. And then he basically said, well, you'll never get flowers from me again, and sort of put his foot down. And it was something that just kept coming up and coming up and coming up. And I finally got to a point where I thought, we have to deal with this, because I don't want to go through a flowerless marriage, but also I want to fix it, and I wanted to make it better. And so one of the things that we learned when we did finally get some support with that communication, with that particular piece of communication, was that everyone remembers an experience their own way. So the real fact of the matter is whatever happened is how you interpret it happened. And so that was really healing, I think, for both of us, because I was able to realize that what I said really hurt, cut deep, and how he, and then also the aftermath of that. And so we just got to a place where I also understood how hurtful that was, that verbal assassin. I didn't understand that. And so we got to a place where we really both sort of said, okay, we're going to heal this, and we're going to go beyond this. And actually, he gave me these 2 hanging flower pots that are in the garden, and they come back, they're perennial. So we were able to not only go past that, but he was able to give me something that I can look out the window every single day and see. And every year we get different pansies that come up, and we get different colors, like the leaves in the winter go purple, and then in the summer they go green. And it was a really special thing, but it was a very good example of bad communication that we had to actually heal from in order to move forward on. And that issue doesn't come up over and over again, but it used to. And then what happens is then you go, well, you always, and you never. And I still have a tendency to when I'm not getting my way, to then lean right into the, well, you never, and you always, and da 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 da. And but I think I've also got a little bit of avoidance in me. I've got a little bit of, forgetting to do the toilet roll thing. Actually, at one point, Tim started putting the toilet rolls, because I wasn't throwing them away. He started putting them on top of picture frames in our house so that I couldn't reach. So that I could see just how many toilet rolls I was leaving out.
Well, by the way, so let's talk about Tim's communication here, which makes me laugh, because what's so great about what he did. Well, and first of all, Joy, thank you for sharing that. That's super vulnerable and really beautiful.
He just brought me a cup of tea, by the way.
Oh my God. Okay. We love you, Tim.
We do love him. He's great.
Yeah, we really love you. And I actually think that metaphor of the perennials is really beautiful, because what this is leading to is that in 1,000 people I interviewed about communication, I asked, what's your most important practice? And I did that on social media really vaguely, because I was hoping that not one person would answer me back communication. I'm here to tell you communication is your most important practice. In the workplace and at home, when I asked them, why do you communicate? It was always some transactional reason. Well, to tell my son he forgot his phone, to tell my husband he has to pick up, it's always transactional. What I never heard was, I communicate with joy to get better at communicating with joy. That's what I want to hear. And that's what leads to being able to ask for what you need. Now, I'll just tell you about Tim because it's so fun. So typically when somebody does a verbal assassin, you will hear back an all or nothing. That's actually a very common pattern. So the verbal assassin says something and then the other person says, well, I will never give you flowers ever again.
Oh, that makes sense.
So that's actually so he went to all or nothing after you did a verbal assassin. That's actually a very common pattern. And again, you can all be like, oh my God, we're doing that thing again. I did verbal assassin, you did all or nothing. Like when you can start to recognize what you're doing, it becomes so much easier and more fun to disarm it. Even in the workplace, this happens. But the other interesting thing was he did something similar to the woman in the I'm going to murder my partner in front of 27,000 members, because what he said was, so I'm not going to communicate about domestic life because it's too triggering to talk to Joy. So what I'm going to do is dump wet clothes on my partner's pillow because they forget to put them in the dryer, right? He started to do that type of behavior, that avoidance around the toilet paper roll. So again, that's just,
well, now let me say one thing.
My fault. Yes.
He did tell me I should put the toilet roll, and he got to the point where he's like, you're not listening to me, so I'm going to do this. But I will say one thing also.
It's desperation. It becomes desperation. Yes. And again, that's what that woman said. The woman said to me, I've tried to talk about the home life. It wasn't like she just unloaded a murder threat in a 27,000 member forum from nowhere. She had tried to talk about home, but because she got shut down, there was nowhere to go. Yeah. And that's why, again, if you look at it as a practice, if you start practicing check-ins, we're going to check in once a night or once a week.
You talked about that in your book, and I thought, oh my gosh, we've got to start doing that, because I think a little bit of, and I think this comes with however long you've been married, and this is, you can be living in a house with someone and you have communication issues. It's not just, not just marriage. It's not. But I will say it is, you're right. That check-in is so important, and the ability to, and I think we should talk about how you check in and talk about communicate boundaries, because you mentioned that as being really important. I'll just say one little thing that I think would be really fun to mention. And I think this is one of the blessings of my husband. And I think one of the reasons that, our marriage has survived, and this is our 13th year of marriage, and, that we still got a long way to go, but there's different phases, right? As you go through different things. Very early on in our marriage, he was always saying to me, could you pick up the clothes off the floor? Could you pick up the clothes off the floor? I definitely have a floor-drobe. And, and so at one point I was out for the day and I came back, and he had, we were living in Switzerland. I'd left my ski stuff out, and I came back and he had created 2 human beings on the bed with all of the clothes. And the ski boots, like on the bottom at the end of the bed. And I literally walked in and I screamed because I thought there were actual human beings on our bed. And I will say one of the things that he has always done really well, and it's like the toilet roll. It's like it's if he can't get through verbally, he creates a visual that's funny. It did crack me.
I love it. It's so funny.
And I think that's been really, and I think with our children as well, probably when I was younger and would just lean towards the yelling drill sergeant, he was really great at like diffusing the situation, making people laugh, getting people into a low emotion, high cognition position to then have a conversation and then move on with the day. And those are really great skills that I've had to learn, really from
humor. I will say that's the beauty of knowing who you are, because you can always just say, well, oh shit, let's stop this dance because I'm doing that verbal assassin thing again. And it just disarms somebody when you're willing to take ownership of your own shit before you go into their shit. And then what happens is if you get into a pattern of having high cognition, low emotion conversations in a repetitive pattern, again, this is science, not just Eve. This is based on 50 years of organizational management. What we know about leadership positions is you do this with your colleagues, they're more likely to tell you bad news. They're more likely to actually invest in a true conversation where you can also hear back. So instead of being like, oh, how was your day? It would be Tim saying, you know what? It's real. I feel like my time is not valued because I spend so much time picking up your clothes from the floor. And then you're more willing to say, wow, I don't want your time not to feel valued. I would love to do something about that because I care about you. And then you also can start saying things like, hey, I heard this woman talking about most domestic life is, people are associating it with like overwhelm and boredom. Like, I don't really want to live a life of overwhelm and boredom. Like, do you? Like, what if we decided instead, like we can just talk about the things that make us come alive and make sure we each have time every single week to do those things.
And that's where the check-in's really helpful.
That's what the check-in's for.
Yeah.
It's to ask for what you need in advance. And again, even I had forgotten that. That's what the unavailability Post-it was. I was just walking around the house with an unavailable Post-it on instead of actually sitting down and saying, you're raining on my parade, family. When you come and interrupt me during my writing time, you are like the kids in the water park when we have the private section who tried demanding their way in because it's their turn, but we booked it from 1 to 3. And then my kids are like, that's not fair. It's our party from 1 to 3. I'm like, yeah, well, you're crashing my party. And then they start to really understand the unfairness of what it is to crash someone's party. But that took, again, investing in high cognition conversations. Now let's talk about high cognition conversations for yourself, since we're deep diving into, and then I want to play a game with everybody. But the high cognition conversations with ourselves require understanding the role of guilt and shame in our self-talk. So we just spent a lot of time with how we communicate with others. But let's take a step back for 1 second and talk about how we communicate with ourselves. I can't do that. I have to be there. I should do that. This is the self-talk. And what's interesting about guilt and shame, Joy, was that of all emotions, I used one of my kids' emotion charts, one of those things they get in school. It's like the 12 emotions. Actually, guilt and shame isn't always on those, which I think is really funny, but I added them on and I said, and I asked a lot of women to talk to me about these different emotions, happiness, sadness. And what was fascinating was guilt and shame were the two emotions most people told me they were acting on. They were making decisions based on those emotions.
Oh,
that's what was scaring me.
Yeah.
So I had a piano lesson, but my child doesn't like to stay at daycare when it's dark out. I canceled my piano lesson because I felt guilty for leaving my child in a daycare when it's dark out. When guilt and shame start affecting your decision-making, you have to change your self-talk. And again, this is not saying we have to fix women. We are living in a system that's conditioned us since birth to feel guilt and shame because it's a great tool of the patriarchy. But we can do our part. We can have agency. And so one of the main helpful reframes in unicorn space is starting a guilt and shame journal or a guilt and shame Post-it, where if you feel guilty about something, you write down, I feel guilty for not putting Anna to bed tonight. Now I cross that out and I write, I made the decision not to put Anna to bed tonight because.
Mm-hmm. I loved that part of the book.
It's fascinating because I have a journal, a Moleskine of doing that now for over a year. And when I look back and I'm like, I felt guilty because I didn't pick up Ben because I had to take a trip. I'm like, what? Felt guilty for like not showing up at some random ass volleyball game that didn't even matter. Like you can look back and see with cognition that those feelings are not things you have to act on.
Yeah. Well, and I love I mean, Brene Brown, you've talked about her, and,
Yes.
she's a huge voice in this space, but she really taught me the difference between the person and the
Right.
thing, right? So when, as parents, very often, and not everyone here is a parent, but you will say, one of the, and I would call it an unskilled way to say it, right? One of the most unskilled ways to show love to someone is to say, you're a bad kid for doing that. And it's really separating the thing that they did,
Right.
as being bad, from the actual person from being bad. And also, but this goes one step further, and it's saying that we're telling ourselves, well, it's bad that you did that. And it's actually reframing it and saying, well, there's a reason why I did that. And I love what you said. I made a decision to do that. And you're in control of that decision. You're in control of that choice. And,
And the narrative to your kids, because when
Yeah.
you're like, oh, Anna, I feel so bad, I'm not going to see you tonight. No, it's like, Anna, how great is this? I get to have dinner with my two best friends, just like you have Daniela, who doesn't use you for your charms. And you have Nora, and you're so lucky that you have them. That's important for me too. And so it's just a really beautiful way to start looking at our own way that we talk to ourselves. And one more thing about guilt and shame that Brene Brown talks about, or that a lot of psychologists talk about, social workers talk about, is the guilt. And this is what I saw in my research. I take it a little further, or a little different. The guilt is, I feel guilty because I'm leaving my child in daycare, right? So that guilt is what you act on, right? Or someone would act on, right? That's what was happening. I was getting those reports. The shame is coming if you don't feel guilty enough to act on it. So you literally can't win. So I don't feel shame for leaving my kid in daycare. Actually, it makes me feel really good not to see my kids that often. Oh my God, I'm a terrible human for saying that I'd rather be in a root canal chair than hang out with Anna. And I've said that to her face, but that's true. Like when she gets older, that may not be the case, but she's 5. So I said, the studies show, Anna, like most parents would rather be in a root canal chair than hang out with a toddler. By studies, I mean me. So and then there, of course, there's a lot of shame that comes up with those feelings, but that's how we feel. I mean, the studies show,
well, and this is why communication is so important, right?
Totally.
That's
We
where
don't have to do that. That would be a verbal assassin. So I wouldn't say that particularly.
But this is the point. And actually, one of the things we talk about all the time at TechPixies is how we speak to ourselves and how we speak to others. And, because the way we speak to ourselves, one of the exercises we do is when someone is reframing something, we have them do what's called a refute. And they say to someone else, they're not actually in the room, but like they're in the bathroom, they're talking to the mirror. They say to someone that they love the same things that they say to themselves, right? And what we find is it's very emotional for people to say to someone else, even if they're not in the room, the things that they say to themselves. And when people realize how much it hurts to say what they say to themselves to someone else, they then realize how much they're beating themselves up. So it does start with loving yourself and being able to speak kindly to yourself. It's a lot easier if you're being kind to yourself to then be kind to others. But this awareness, noticing what you're noticing, being aware of your thoughts, being careful with the language that you use, not just for yourself, but people around you, because it creates that communication environment, that safe communication environment.
What I think we want to end on is we spend a lot of time in the passion gap, the fact that we lose our curiosity in this because we lose our permission to be unavailable. But what's really interesting is the most important C, I think, is the second one, the connection, because the beauty, obviously you have each other here. So you're investing in this time together. That's amazing. It's linked to your mental health and longevity. But the other beautiful thing is when you can really think about why you share, why you build and share. It's a very powerful thing. Is it to honor the past? Is it to get feedback? Is it to get better? Is it to have accountability, whether it's a marathon or triathlon? Do you do it to show up for somebody else? Understanding the motivation for why you want to share yourself with the world, spending some time understanding and unpacking those motivations is also a really beautiful exercise as well.
And Alexandra said, and again, I'll ask you to email us back because
Yeah.
you've got to go, but why is unicorn magic a necessity? I thought it was only for the privileged. I'd love to set aside a weekly time for mine. I would love to know your answer to that. So,
well, I will say something really important. The people, it was sort of strangely correlated the opposite. The people who identified in the upper middle class and in the 9.9% had a harder time telling me what their unicorn space was. And why I asked a lot of creatives that question, one of the answers that stood out was from a friend named Mark Bamuthi Joseph, who's a spoken word poet, who said, a lot of communities that haven't had financial capital have had to trade in other types of capital. And creative capital becomes a really important part of their lives. But as we become conditioned to believe that money, a bigger house, a nicer car, better schools, more kids is the way to happiness or is the only path, or the linear promotions, all those things, it takes us farther away. It's like the bigger our milestones in that way, our extrinsic milestones, the smaller we have to get to shrink into them. And so I will say that
truth in that, I think
it's much more complicated than just unicorn space and privilege. This is it's subversive for women to take up space. Uninterrupted attention for things we love it can't be a privilege. It's the last frontier of feminism. And our time being chopped up into 3-minute increments anymore is what's kept us small. It's what's kept us out of a place to tinker and dream. That's all Mark Zuckerberg talks about, is like protecting his time to tinker. Okay. How great would it be if we all just say, no, Sundays, we're not doing anything related to unpaid labor or our children. We are just spending it on our time to tinker. We're so far away from that, but we don't have to be, because guess what? 50% of the population do that. Men have twice as much leisure time as we do. So it's happening out there. We just have to follow and see. And by the way, not knowing what your kids ate for lunch or how to plan a birthday party is a great way to get time back into your schedule. So that's why Fair Play is the OG book and why Unicorn Space had to come after it.
Yeah, they're brilliant. And I think your next book has got to be on communication. You're a brilliant communicator. And what I loved was your ability to marry up the different communication styles. And I think there's a lot of us, we can all learn. I love how you said, you identify your communication style and go, okay, here we go again. I understand this one kicks off that one. So I would love a book from you on communication. And of course, you do talk a lot about communication and Fair Play, particularly around, and that question of why you discussed in Unicorn Space. There was a guy who was wanting to run in the mornings, and it was understanding that his dad died of a heart attack young, and he wanted to stay healthy and live longer for his family. And once they understood the why, it was an easier conversation. But also this fully owning something, that was a big shift for Tim and I. It's like, okay, well, if you're in charge of the shopping, you fully own the shopping, and then you therefore fully own the meals. So then if I go shopping, I fully own the shopping and the meals, which is why he still does the shopping and the meals, because I'm not as good of a cook.
Love him.
I do. That's what I said. We had to have that conversation. And so I will tell you, no matter who you are, whatever relationship you're in, whether it's with a partner or with roommates, etc., Fair Play is an excellent way to have a conversation about the roles that you're playing within the household that you're in. And Unicorn Space will challenge you to say, what if I had a day to myself? If I had an hour to myself, what would I do that doesn't count as these things? And I would encourage everyone to do that. Well, Eve, we're going to let you go.
And last thing I'll say, so my homework for you is similar to that woman jumping into the lake and saying that was the most important thing she did that day. My homework for you in the next week, come up with something. The most important thing you will do that day is outside of your roles as a parent and or a partner and or a professional. One time this week. That's
Wait, say that again. We have to do something.
So one day over the next 7 days, you have to choose a day where you tell me the most important thing you will do that day is outside of your roles as a parent and or partner and or professional.
Okay.
And I want to know what you did with that time. So if you could share that with Joy, I'd love to know.
Yeah. And I'll pass that on to Eve.
Yes.
Thank you, Eve, for your time. And don't go anywhere, ladies, because I am going to draw the names
yes.
for the books. Thanks,
Thank
Eve.
you so much. Talk to you soon. Bye.